I still remember the exact sentence that changed how I looked at my family forever. "Don't come to the wedding, Dad. It'll just make things uncomfortable." I heard my father say it from the hallway upstairs, not loudly, not angrily. Worse, calmly, like he'd already rehearsed it in his head a dozen times before finally saying it out loud. I stopped halfway down the stairs without making a sound. My hand stayed frozen on the railing while the living room went quiet for a few seconds. Then my grandfather spoke. But he's my grandson. His voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. I peeked through the gap between the staircase and the wall. Grandpa was sitting in the old brown recliner near the window, shoulders curved inward, hands folded tightly together like he was trying not to shake. My father stood near the fireplace with a drink in his hand. My mother didn't even look up from the wedding seating chart spread across the coffee table. "Please don't make this harder than it already is," she said. "Emily's family is very particular." Particular. That was the word she used instead of cruel. I think that was the moment something inside me cracked, not because my parents were selfish. I'd known that for years, not because my brother stayed silent. That part didn't surprise me either. It was because my grandfather nodded, like he believed he deserved it. I quietly walked back upstairs before anyone noticed me listening. Then I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall for almost an hour. The weird thing about heartbreak is how ordinary the room still looks while it's happening. My laundry basket was still in the corner. My laptop was still open on the desk. Outside, somebody was mowing their lawn. And downstairs, my family was deciding whether my grandfather was embarrassing enough to hide from public view. My name's Claire. I'm 31 years old, and until that month, I still believed families eventually found their way back to each other. I don't believe that anymore, at least not in the simple way I used to. My younger brother Ethan was getting married in 3 weeks. Big wedding. Expensive hotel downtown. White roses everywhere. String quartet during dinner. The kind of wedding people throw when they care more about appearances than breathing comfortably for the next 5 years. Ethan's fiancée came from money. Real money. Her father owned several commercial properties around Seattle. Her mother sat on charity boards and hosted fundraisers where everybody wore beige and spoke softly like they were being filmed for a luxury furniture commercial. My parents were obsessed with impressing them, especially my father. He spent months pretending our family had always belonged in rooms like that. He bought new suits, started talking differently, even laughed differently around them. But there was one problem he couldn't polish into something presentable. My grandfather, Walter Bennett, 78 years old, retired aircraft electrician, widower, Vietnam veteran. The man who practically raised my father after my grandmother died young. To me, Grandpa was warmth. He smelled like coffee and sawdust. He reused aluminum foil. He carried peppermints in his jacket pocket. He still wrote grocery lists on folded envelopes. But to my parents, he was a reminder of the life they were desperate to erase. Working class, aging, unimpressive, human. The saddest part was that Grandpa lived with them, not because he wanted luxury. Because after his second hip surgery, he couldn't safely live alone anymore. And instead of gratitude, they treated him like inconvenient furniture. Visible enough to use when it benefited them, invisible the rest of the time. A few days after I overheard that conversation, I stopped by the house again after work. I'm a freelance editor, so most days I worked remotely from coffee shops or my apartment. That afternoon, I brought Grandpa chicken noodle soup from the deli he liked downtown. When I walked inside, the house smelled like fresh paint samples and floral candles. Wedding chaos. My mother sat at the dining table comparing napkin colors. Ethan was scrolling through his phone. Nobody looked up when I entered except Grandpa. His entire face changed when he saw me. "There's my favorite visitor," he said softly. I smiled and held up the soup bag. "Got your usual." He laughed quietly. "Then you officially know me better than everyone else in this house." It was meant as a joke. That made it worse. I heated the soup while he sat at the kitchen counter, telling me about a documentary he'd watched the night before about old aviation engineers. He loved talking about planes. Always had. When I was little, he used to build model aircraft with me at the dining room table. Tiny pieces everywhere. Glue on our fingers. Jazz music playing softly from his radio. Those are some of the only peaceful memories I have from childhood. While I stirred the soup, my mother suddenly looked over. "Dad," she said casually, "if you do end up attending the ceremony, we'll probably seat you near the back." The spoon stopped in my hand. Grandpa looked confused for a second. "Near the back?" "Well, yes," she replied. "The front tables are mostly reserved for Emily's family and business associates." Business associates. At a wedding, I turned slowly toward her. "You're talking about him like he's a random guest." She sighed immediately, already annoyed by me before I'd even spoken properly. "Claire, not now." "No, actually now is perfect." Ethan groaned from the table. "Can we not do this again?" I stared at him. Again, like defending our grandfather was some exhausting hobby of mine. "He's your grandfather," I said. "Not a problem to manage." Ethan tossed his phone down. "You always make everything dramatic, and you always stay quiet when you should speak." My father walked in right then, probably hearing the tension from the hallway. "What's going on?" "Claire's starting another argument," Ethan muttered. I laughed once. Short. Sharp. That's interesting coming from the guy hiding his grandfather from wedding photos. Dad's face hardened immediately. "We are not hiding anybody." "Really? Because last week you told him not to come." The room went silent. Grandpa stared down at his hands. Mom stood up fast. That conversation was private. It shouldn't have happened at all. Dad stepped closer toward me. "You don't understand how important this wedding is." I looked at him carefully. There was a time when he scared me, not physically, just emotionally. His approval used to feel necessary. Now he mostly looked tired, like somebody who spent years climbing toward a life he didn't even enjoy. "What exactly are you afraid of?" I asked quietly. "That wealthy people might discover your father had a normal job?" Dad's jaw tightened. "You think life is simple because you work from coffee shops and write articles online. The real world has consequences." Grandpa spoke before I could. "It's all right," he said gently. "I don't want trouble." That hurt more than anything else. How quickly he tried making himself smaller so everyone else could stay comfortable. I brought the soup over to him and sat beside him at the counter. Nobody spoke for a while. Then Mom went back to her wedding charts like none of it mattered. That night, Grandpa walked me out to my car. The air smelled like rain. Seattle always smells a little sad in November. He stood on the porch with his thin gray sweater zipped halfway up. "You shouldn't fight with them because of me," he said. I crossed my arms. "Then they shouldn't treat you like this." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "People get strange around money, around status too. You're still defending them. I'm trying to protect you." That almost broke me. Even then, he was worried about me carrying the weight of it. I looked at him carefully under the porch light. He seemed smaller lately, not weaker exactly, just quieter, like he was slowly disappearing while everybody pretended not to notice. "Grandpa," I said softly, "if they don't want you there, I won't go either." His expression changed instantly. "No, I mean it." "No, Claire." His voice became firmer. "You will not miss your brother's wedding because this family forgot how to behave." I looked away toward the streetlights. A long silence sat between us. Then he said something that stayed with me for months afterward. "You know what loneliness really is?" I looked back at him. "It's not being alone." He gave a tired little smile. "It's sitting in a full house while nobody sees you anymore." I couldn't answer, because he was right, and deep down, I think he'd already decided he was leaving long before any of us realized it. 3 days later, my mother accidentally mailed formal invitations to distant cousins, but not to Grandpa. When he asked about it during breakfast, she acted surprised. "Oh, I figured you didn't need one since you live here." I watched his face carefully. He nodded like he accepted the explanation. But later that afternoon, I found him alone in the garage sitting beside old storage boxes, just sitting there quietly. I think he went there whenever he wanted privacy. The garage smelled like motor oil and cold concrete. He was holding an old photograph in his hands, a picture of my grandmother. She died before I was born. He quickly tucked the photo away when he saw me. "Sorry," he said with a little smile. "Didn't mean to hide out here like a criminal. You don't have to apologize for existing." He looked at me for a long moment after that. Then he asked something unexpected. "Do you think people become cruel slowly?" I leaned against the workbench beside him. "I don't know." "I do," he said quietly. He rubbed his thumb against the corner of the photograph. "It happens little by little, one disappointment at a time, one selfish decision at a time. Eventually, they stop noticing other people's pain because they're too focused on protecting themselves." I knew he wasn't only talking about my parents, he was talking about himself too, about all the years he stayed silent, all the times he accepted disrespect just to keep the family together. That night, before I left, he asked if I could help him with something later that week. "Sure," I said. "What is it?" "I want to visit a place." "What kind of place?" He hesitated briefly. Then he smiled in that sad, careful way older people do when they're preparing you for something gently. "A retirement community." And for the first time since all this started, I felt actual fear settle into my chest, because suddenly this wasn't just about a wedding anymore. It was about goodbye. I didn't tell anyone about the retirement community. Not my parents, not Ethan, not even my best friend Nora. Somehow the idea felt too fragile to speak out loud, like the second other people touched it, they'd ruin it. Grandpa asked me to pick him up Friday morning. When I arrived, he was already waiting outside with a small notebook tucked under his arm and his old brown coat buttoned wrong. I fixed the buttons while he smiled sheepishly. "Guess I'm getting rusty." "You've been saying that since 2009. He laughed softly. That laugh used to be common. Now hearing it felt rare enough to protect. The drive to the retirement community took about 40 minutes. Rain tapped lightly against the windshield the entire way. Grandpa spent most of the drive staring out the window, not nervous exactly, more like thoughtful. Finally, he said, "I haven't told your father." I figured. He'll think I'm abandoning him. The irony of that nearly made me grip the steering wheel too hard. "He abandoned you first," I said quietly. Grandpa didn't answer. After a while, he sighed. "I keep wondering where I went wrong with him." I glanced over. "You didn't." All parents think that until they are old enough to see their mistakes clearly. The thing about Grandpa was that he always spoke gently, even when he was hurting. Especially then. The retirement community sat outside the city near a wooded area with walking paths and gardens. It wasn't flashy. No marble fountains, no luxury branding. Just peaceful. A wooden sign near the entrance read, "Maple Grove Living Community." The moment we walked inside, something shifted in Grandpa's face. A woman at the front desk looked up immediately and smiled warmly. "Walter, right?" We spoke on the phone. She came around the desk and shook his hand with both of hers, not rushed, not forced. Present, that alone almost made me emotional. I'd gotten so used to seeing people overlook him that basic kindness felt overwhelming. Her name was Denise. She gave us a tour of the place while soft piano music played somewhere down the hall. Residents sat together doing puzzles near a fireplace. A group of older women argued cheerfully over cards in the lounge. One man watered plants while humming quietly to himself, and nobody looked invisible. That's what struck me most. People actually acknowledged each other here. A nurse passing through stopped to ask one resident about her granddaughter's recital. A maintenance worker paused to help another man adjust his scarf before they both joked about the Seahawks. Tiny moments. Human moments. Grandpa noticed them too. I could tell. His shoulders slowly relaxed during the tour. At one point, we passed a woodworking room. He stopped walking. Inside, 2 residents and an instructor were sanding pieces of cedar at a large table. Grandpa stared through the glass like a child looking into a toy store. "You have a workshop here?" he asked quietly. Denise smiled. "A very popular one." "He used to build furniture," I said, "and model airplanes." Grandpa looked embarrassed immediately. "Oh, nothing special." Denise shook her head. "You'd be surprised how many people here would love to learn." I saw something flicker across his face then. Not excitement exactly. Possibility. I hadn't seen that expression on him in years. Later we toured one of the private rooms. Small, simple, but warm. Bookshelf by the window, soft lighting, a recliner near the bed, bird feeder outside. Grandpa walked slowly through the room, touching the edge of the desk with his fingertips. "It's quiet here," he murmured. Denise nodded gently. "People deserve peace as they get older." I had to look away for a second after she said that, because peace was exactly what he'd been missing. On the drive back home, Grandpa stayed quiet most of the time. Then suddenly he asked, "Did I fail your father by helping him too much?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" "When he struggled financially, I always rescued him, even when I didn't really have the money." I remembered all of it. The second mortgage, the loans, the years Grandpa quietly sacrificed pieces of his own stability whenever Dad's business crashed, and somehow Dad still acted like it had never been enough. "You loved him," I said. Grandpa gave a tired smile. "Sometimes loving people the wrong way destroys them too." That sentence stayed with me, because deep down I think he knew the truth. My father had spent his whole life expecting others to clean up the emotional messes he created, and Grandpa helped teach him that, not intentionally. Just slowly, the way families do. A week before the wedding, things inside the house got worse. Every conversation became about appearances. Flowers, guest lists, table placements. My mother acted like she was preparing for a royal ceremony instead of a marriage between 2 people barely mature enough to share a checking account. One evening, I stopped by unexpectedly and found Grandpa eating dinner alone in the kitchen. Microwaved soup, crackers, that was it. Meanwhile, the dining room table behind him was covered with catered food samples from the wedding planner. I looked around. "Where is everybody?" "Venue tasting," he replied. "You weren't invited." He smiled without looking up. I don't think they remembered. I sat down slowly across from him. For a moment, I honestly couldn't speak. There's a specific kind of sadness that doesn't arrive dramatically. It just settles quietly inside your chest until breathing feels heavier. That's what I felt sitting there watching him crumble crackers into soup by himself. "Grandpa," I said carefully, "you don't have to stay here." He stirred the soup slowly. I know. That answer scared me, because it sounded final. That night, after he went upstairs, I confronted my parents in the living room. "You're humiliating him." Mom barely glanced up from her laptop. "Claire, not tonight." "No, tonight." Dad muted the television with visible annoyance. "What now?" "You left him home alone while you went tasting expensive wedding food. He said he wasn't hungry. He says that because none of you care whether he eats or not." Dad exhaled sharply. "You're turning this into abuse accusations now, if the shoe fits." Mom stood immediately. "Enough. Your father and I have worked ourselves sick paying for this wedding while you sit around criticizing everything." I laughed bitterly. "There it is." "What?" "The transaction." Mom stared at me. You think because you spend money on things, it excuses how you treat people. That's not fair. No, what's unfair is treating your elderly father like an embarrassment because rich strangers might judge you. Dad stood up too then. You have absolutely no understanding of social pressure. And you have no understanding of loyalty. The room went dead silent. Then Dad said something I'll never forget. Your grandfather never belonged in rooms like this. I felt physically sick hearing it, because my father genuinely believed status determined human value. I stared at him for several seconds before answering. He built airplanes for 35 years. Dad rolled his eyes slightly. So thousands of people trusted their lives to work he helped create. I stepped closer. What exactly have you built besides debt and insecurity? His face changed instantly. That landed hard. Get out, he said quietly. Mom looked shocked. Richard, no, she wants to disrespect this family. She can leave. I looked at both of them carefully, then toward the hallway upstairs where Grandpa was probably pretending not to hear any of it. You know what's amazing? I said softly. One day you're both going to be old too. Neither of them spoke. And when that happens, I hope somebody treats you better than you treated him. I left before they could answer. 2 days later, Grandpa called me early in the morning. His voice sounded strange. Calm, too calm. Could you come by? Are you okay? Yes. A pause. I just need help organizing some things. When I arrived, he was sitting at the dining room table surrounded by paperwork, legal forms, property records, bank documents. I stared at him. What is all this? He adjusted his glasses carefully. I've decided to move. My stomach dropped even though I already knew. When? Soon. Does Dad know? No. He looked down at the papers. I wanted to make sure everything was settled first. I sat slowly across from him. You're serious? Yes. The silence between us felt enormous. Then he said something quietly that nearly shattered me. I don't think I can survive another year here. Not physically. Emotionally, I understood that immediately. He looked exhausted in a way sleep couldn't fix, like somebody who'd spent too long begging silently for basic love. I reached across the table and held his hand. You shouldn't have had to survive your own family. His eyes became watery instantly, but he smiled anyway. I got you out of it at least. I almost cried right there, because even now he was measuring his life through what he managed to give other people. The next hour changed everything. Grandpa explained that he planned to sell his house, not the one my parents lived in, his original house. The small one across town he'd rented out after moving in with them following surgery. I'd almost forgotten he still owned it. It's worth much more now, he said. The neighborhood changed. What are you going to do with the money? He smiled faintly. Something useful. That was all he said at first. Then he asked me something unexpected. You still working with that community nonprofit? I nodded. A small storytelling organization I'd helped build. We worked mostly with isolated seniors and low-income community programs. Grandpa had always supported it more than anyone else in my family. He actually read my articles, asked questions, remembered details, unlike my parents who still described my work as that blog thing. I want to help people who feel forgotten, he said quietly. I looked at him carefully. You mean donate? I mean all of it. I blinked. Grandpa, I spent years trying to leave something behind for this family. His voice remained calm. But money given without love turns poisonous. I didn't know what to say. Part of me understood completely. Another part felt terrified about what would happen when my family discovered it. You know they'll lose their minds. He chuckled softly. Yes. Then his expression became serious again. But Claire, if I leave them money, it won't heal them. It'll only feed the worst parts of them. That was the exact moment I realized he'd already emotionally let go of the family. Not out of revenge, out of exhaustion. Later that afternoon, we drove together to meet his attorney. Martin Hale, quiet man, mid-50s, sharp eyes, he greeted Grandpa with genuine respect, not fake politeness. Respect. During the meeting, Grandpa calmly explained every decision: the house sale, the retirement community, the donation fund, advanced care directives, everything, like a man finally taking ownership of his life again. At one point, Martin looked at him carefully and asked, "Are you certain this is what you want?" Grandpa answered immediately, "For the first time in years." Driving home afterward, the sky had turned dark blue with evening rain beginning again. Grandpa looked lighter somehow, still sad, but lighter, as if making the decision had returned oxygen to his lungs. Then quietly, almost to himself, he said, "I think people deserve to spend the last part of their life somewhere they feel wanted." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, because deep down, I knew what he was really saying. He hadn't felt wanted in a very long time, and nobody in our family noticed until he stopped trying to stay. At all. The morning of the wedding felt wrong from the second I opened my eyes. You know how sometimes your body senses disaster before your mind catches up? That's how it felt. Heavy, quiet, like something terrible had already happened overnight and the world just hadn't announced it yet. Rain pressed softly against my apartment windows while I stared at my bridesmaid dress hanging from the closet door. Dusty blue, expensive, completely meaningless. My phone showed 3 unread messages from my mother. "Don't be late. Hair appointment moved to 10. Please do not start drama today." That last line almost made me laugh, as if basic human decency counted as drama in our family. I tried calling Grandpa before getting ready. No answer. I waited a few minutes and called again. Still nothing. A strange feeling crawled into my stomach. He usually answered by the second ring. Even if he was asleep, he answered. I texted him, "Morning, Grandpa. Thinking about you today." No response. By noon, I was standing inside a luxury hotel ballroom pretending everything was normal. The place looked beautiful in the artificial way expensive weddings always do. White flowers, gold chairs, crystal chandeliers, soft piano music floating through the room while guests smiled carefully at one another. Nobody relaxed. That's what I remember most. Nobody actually relaxed. Everyone looked like they were performing wealth. My mother moved around the venue like an event manager possessed by anxiety. My father kept adjusting his tie every 10 minutes. Ethan stood near the bar with his groomsmen pretending marriage wasn't terrifying him. And through all of it, one empty space followed me everywhere. Grandpa should have been there. I kept imagining him sitting quietly in the back row, straightening his tie nervously, smiling during the ceremony, probably crying a little. He loved emotional moments but always tried hiding it. Instead, wealthy strangers filled the seats while the man who loved Ethan first stayed hidden away like a shameful secret. I couldn't stop thinking about it. During makeup, one bridesmaid asked casually, "So where are Ethan's grandparents sitting?" The room went awkwardly silent for half a second. Then my mother answered quickly. His grandfather wasn't feeling well enough to attend. I looked at her reflection in the mirror. She didn't even blink while lying. Something about that chilled me. How easily people rewrite reality once protecting their image becomes more important than truth. The ceremony itself passed like a blur. The officiant spoke about family and loyalty. I nearly lost my mind hearing it. Ethan smiled at his bride. Guests cried softly. Champagne glasses clinked afterward beneath warm lighting while photographers staged fake, candid moments. Every few minutes somebody said some version of, "This is perfect." But it wasn't, because all I could think about was an old man sitting alone somewhere wondering whether his family truly stopped loving him. Around 6 that evening, I slipped away from the reception and tried calling Grandpa again. Straight to voicemail. My chest tightened. I stepped outside into the cold hotel courtyard and dialed faster this time. Still nothing. Then I called the house. No answer there either. For a moment, panic flooded me so hard I couldn't breathe properly. What if he'd fallen? What if something happened and nobody noticed because everybody was too busy drinking champagne under hanging roses? I went back inside, immediately looking for my father. I found him near the dance floor laughing with Emily's father. Dad. He barely glanced over. What? I can't reach Grandpa. His expression changed instantly to irritation instead of concern. He's probably sleeping. It's 6 in the evening. So? He always answers. Dad sighed sharply. Claire, not tonight, not tonight, that phrase again, always later, always after appearances were secured. What if something happened? He's fine, you don't know that. Dad lowered his voice immediately, smile still frozen on his face for nearby guests. For once in your life, stop making everything emotional. I stared at him, then at the room around us. Music, laughter, champagne. And suddenly I felt completely disconnected from every person there. Like I was watching strangers pretend to be my family. I grabbed my coat. Where are you going? Mom asked sharply when she saw me heading toward the exit. To check on Grandpa. For God's sake, Claire? No, my voice came out louder than I intended. Several nearby guests turned. I'm done pretending this is normal. Then I walked out. Rain hit my face the second I reached the parking lot, cold and sharp. I drove too fast across the city with my heart hammering the entire time. Every red light felt unbearable. By the time I reached the house, my hands were shaking. The downstairs lights were off, so was the porch lamp. Something felt wrong immediately. Deeply wrong. I rushed to the front door and used the spare key hidden beneath the flower pot. The moment I stepped inside, I froze. Silence. Not normal silence. Empty silence. The house smelled different. Bare. I turned on the hallway light. Then my stomach dropped. The walls were empty. The framed photographs were gone. The small wooden table near the staircase was missing too. I walked farther inside slowly. The living room furniture had disappeared. The bookshelves were empty. No television, no blankets, nothing. The house looked hollowed out, like somebody had carefully erased a life from inside it. Grandpa? My voice echoed, no answer. Panic surged through me instantly. I moved through the house faster now. Kitchen, garage, bedroom, empty, everything empty. Then I saw the envelope sitting alone on the kitchen counter. My name written neatly across the front. Claire. My hands shook while opening it. Inside was a short handwritten note. Sweetheart, I didn't want you finding out alone this way, but I knew you'd come looking for me. I'm all right. Actually, I think I'm better than all right. Thank you for helping me remember I still deserve dignity. Please don't worry, I'm somewhere peaceful now. And for the first time in years, I don't feel like I'm waiting for permission to exist. I love you. Grandpa. I sat down hard in one of the only remaining kitchen chairs because suddenly my legs stopped working properly. He'd gone, not temporarily. Gone. And somehow, even though I knew this was coming, the reality still hit like grief. I cried right there alone in the empty kitchen while rain tapped softly against the windows. Not because he left, because of why he needed to. About 20 minutes later, my phone exploded with calls from my mother. Then my father, then Ethan. I ignored all of them. Eventually I answered. Where are you? Dad snapped immediately. At Grandpa's house. A pause. What? He's gone. Silence, then. What do you mean gone? The house is empty. Within 45 minutes, all of them arrived still dressed in wedding clothes. My mother stepped into the living room and gasped. Ethan looked genuinely confused. Dad looked furious. Not heartbroken. Furious, like this was an inconvenience done to him personally. Where is he? Mom demanded. I handed Dad the note silently. He read it once, then again. His face slowly turned red. He sold the house? I looked at him in disbelief. That was his first concern, not whether Grandpa was okay, not why he left. The house. The note says he's safe. How long did you know? Dad barked suddenly. I met his stare evenly. A while. Mom looked horrified. You helped him? Yes. How could you do this to us? I actually laughed, a broken, exhausted laugh. To you? Dad slammed the note onto the counter. That house was part of this family's future. No, I said quietly, it was part of his life. Ethan finally spoke. Wait, where's the money from the sale? There it finally was, the real grief money. I stared at my brother in complete disbelief. Are you serious right now? He could have at least discussed it with us first. With the people who banned him from his grandson's wedding, Mom folded her arms tightly. You don't understand how humiliating this is. I looked around the stripped house slowly. The emptiness, the silence, the life removed piece by piece, then back at her. No, I said softly, you don't understand humiliation. Nobody spoke. For a second, I almost thought guilt might finally reach them. Then Dad said, he's being manipulated. I blinked. What? You filled his head with all this nonprofit nonsense and turned him against his own family. Something inside me snapped then. Completely, you turned him against you. Dad stepped closer. Watch your tone. No, you watch yours. My voice shook now, years of swallowed anger finally breaking open. That man spent decades loving people who only noticed him when they needed something. Mom tried interrupting. Claire? No. I pointed toward the empty hallway. You left him alone in this house while you chased status and rich friends and perfect photographs. Dad's face hardened dangerously. He was never neglected. He was emotionally abandoned. The silence afterward felt enormous. Ethan looked away first. Good, he should have. You know what the saddest part is? I said quietly. He still defended all of you. Nobody answered, because it was true. Even after everything, Grandpa still protected them, still made excuses for them, still loved them, and they mistook that love for weakness. Dad grabbed the note again. He says not to contact him? Yes, that's ridiculous. I'm his son, and he's still a person. Dad looked ready to explode, but before he could speak, I said the thing I'd been holding back for years. He didn't leave because he's old. I looked at each of them carefully. He left because none of you made him feel wanted anymore. Mom's eyes filled instantly with tears, not full remorse, not yet, but something cracked. Finally, Ethan sat down heavily at the kitchen table and rubbed both hands over his face. The tuxedo, the wedding ring, the expensive shoes. Suddenly he looked less like a groom and more like a lost little boy. Do you know where he is? He asked quietly. I hesitated, then nodded once. Dad straightened immediately. Take us there. No. His expression darkened. What do you mean no? I mean he asked for space, and unlike the rest of you, I actually respect his wishes. Claire, no. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of disappointing them anymore. Maybe because I finally understood something important. Keeping peace inside a toxic family usually means sacrificing the healthiest person first, and I was done volunteering for that role. Dad pointed toward the door furiously. If you walk out right now, I will. I grabbed my coat, then paused near the kitchen entrance. The empty house behind them looked almost symbolic now, a monument to everything they failed to value until it disappeared. I looked at my father one last time. You spent so much energy trying to impress strangers, I said quietly, and you lost the one person who loved you unconditionally. Then I walked out into the rain, and for the first time in years, I didn't look back. I visited Grandpa the next morning, not because he asked me to, because I needed to see with my own eyes that he was okay. Really okay. Maple Grove sat beneath a gray morning sky, quiet except for birds moving through the wet trees near the entrance. Rainwater still clung to the garden paths from the night before. The receptionist smiled the second I walked in. You must be Claire. That caught me off guard. You know who I am? She laughed softly. Walter's been talking about you nonstop. Something tightened painfully in my chest. Of course he had. I followed her down the hallway toward the community lounge, and then I heard it. My grandfather laughing, not polite laughter, not the careful little chuckle he used at family dinners before going silent again. Real laughter, warm, relaxed, alive. I stopped walking for a second. Inside the lounge, 4 residents sat around a table playing cards while an older jazz song played softly from a nearby speaker. Grandpa looked up first. The second he saw me, his entire face lit up. There she is. I don't know why that almost made me cry immediately. Maybe because somebody sounding genuinely happy to see me felt unfamiliar after the previous night. He stood carefully, and before I could say anything, he hugged me tightly. "You came?" "Of course I came." He pulled back slightly, studying my face. "You look exhausted. I could say the same thing about the last 10 years of your life." That made him laugh again. God, I'd missed hearing that sound. The others at the table introduced themselves one by one. Margaret, Lou, Frank, an older woman named Helen who immediately accused Grandpa of cheating at cards. "He pretends not to understand the rules," she told me, narrowing her eyes playfully. "Then somehow he wins anyway." Grandpa looked offended. "I served this country honorably." Frank snorted. "And now you hustle seniors for quarters." The whole table burst into laughter again. I just stood there quietly watching them for a moment. Watching him. And suddenly, I understood something devastating. He looked more at home after one night here than he had during the last 5 years living with family. That realization hurt more than I expected. Later, we sat together near the indoor garden area while sunlight slowly pushed through the clouds outside. Residents wandered through casually. A nurse stopped to remind Grandpa about movie night later. Another staff member asked if he still wanted help setting up his workshop orientation next week. Workshop orientation. Like his future still mattered, like there were still things worth beginning. "I was worried about you," I admitted quietly. Grandpa smiled gently. "I know. You disappeared." "I needed to." He looked out toward the rain-covered trees. "Last night was the first time I slept through the night in years." That stunned me. "Years?" He nodded slowly. "I used to lie awake wondering whether I was making everybody miserable just by existing." I looked down immediately because hearing that out loud physically hurt. No one should feel that way in their own family. Maybe not. A pause, but it happens more than people realize. He said it calmly, not bitterly. That somehow made it sadder. I asked him if he regretted leaving. He answered instantly. "No." Then softer. "I only regret staying after I realized love had turned into obligation." We sat in silence for a while after that. Comfortable silence, not the strained kind that filled my parents' house. At one point, he reached into his sweater pocket and handed me a folded piece of paper. "What's this?" "Read it later." I slipped it into my bag without opening it. Then he smiled faintly. "Your father called 23 times." I stared at him. "You counted." "He's persistent when money disappears." That shouldn't have made me laugh, but it did, and Grandpa laughed too, then his expression softened. "Do you hate them?" The question caught me completely off guard. I thought carefully before answering. "No." "Good. I'm angry. That's different." I looked toward the windows. "I think I'm grieving people who are still alive." Grandpa nodded slowly. "Yes." His voice turned distant for a second. "That's one of the hardest griefs there is." Around lunchtime, we ate together in the dining hall, and honestly, I wasn't prepared for how emotional it would make me. Not because the place was sad, because it wasn't. That's what shattered me. People talk to each other here. Really talked. One resident discussed books with a volunteer. Another proudly showed off photos of her great-grandchildren to anybody willing to look. Someone argued passionately about baseball stats from 1978. Life still existed here. Connection still existed here. Meanwhile, my parents acted like aging itself was some embarrassing failure to hide behind closed doors. At one point, an elderly man named Bernard sat beside us carrying a tray of soup and grilled cheese. He nodded toward Grandpa. "You're the airplane guy." Grandpa grinned. "That's me." Bernard looked at me. "He spent 20 minutes yesterday explaining propeller mechanics to me." "I did not." "You absolutely did." Bernard smiled warmly. "He talks about planes the way some people talk about first love." I looked at Grandpa. His eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, and suddenly I remembered sitting beside him as a little girl while he built model aircraft on the kitchen table. Patient hands, gentle voice, tiny screws lined up carefully on napkins. He used to explain every piece to me like I mattered enough to understand. Nobody else in the family had patience like that, not even close. After lunch, Grandpa showed me the woodworking room. His woodworking room now, apparently. A few unfinished shelves leaned against the wall beside neatly organized tools. The scent of cedar and sanded pine filled the air. His entire posture changed inside that room. Lighter, steadier, like he remembered himself there. "I'm teaching a beginner class next month," he said almost shyly. "That's amazing. I haven't taught anybody in years. That's their loss." He smiled at me quietly. "You always knew how to make me feel useful." The second he said it, guilt hit me hard, because I suddenly wondered how many years he spent feeling useless before anyone noticed, before I noticed enough. That evening, when I finally prepared to leave, Grandpa walked me toward the entrance. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. Cold sunlight filtered through wet trees, beautiful in that quiet Pacific Northwest way. Before I got into my car, he touched my arm gently. "You should probably prepare yourself." "For what?" "Your father won't let this go." I sighed tiredly. "I know. He'll blame you." "He already does." Grandpa looked genuinely pained by that. I never wanted to divide the family. I met his eyes carefully. "You didn't." A long silence passed between us. Then I finally asked the question sitting heavily inside my chest since yesterday. "Were you planning this for a long time?" He nodded. "How long?" "About a year. A year, an entire year carrying that loneliness privately. Researching places, planning an exit, realizing he needed to save himself from his own family. And nobody noticed. Not one person, because nobody was paying attention." Back at my apartment that night, I finally unfolded the paper he'd given me earlier. It was a handwritten list, things I want to do while I still can. I sat down slowly while reading it. Teach woodworking again. Grow tomatoes next spring. Visit the coast one more time. See live jazz music. Learn how to use video calls properly. Tell my story before I forget parts of it. Make new friends, feel useful again. At the bottom, smaller handwriting stretched across the page. "Stop apologizing for taking up space." I cried harder reading that than I had at the empty house, because no human being should have to write that sentence at 78 years old. The next week exploded. My father called constantly, left furious voicemails, demanded meetings, accused me of manipulating Grandpa. My mother sent long emotional texts about family betrayal and humiliation. Ethan stayed mostly quiet. That almost bothered me more. Then one afternoon, Dad showed up at my apartment unannounced. The second I opened the door, I knew this wouldn't end well. He looked exhausted. Wrinkled shirt, dark circles under his eyes, anger barely contained beneath the surface. "Invite me in." "No." His jaw tightened immediately. "You're seriously doing this? What do you want?" "To see my father. He doesn't want visitors right now. He's being influenced." I almost laughed. "You still can't imagine he made this decision himself." Dad stepped closer. "You poisoned him against us." "No." I listened to him when nobody else would. His face hardened instantly. You think you're morally superior because you spent time with an old man? I stared at him in disbelief. An old man, that's how he referred to his own father now. I think I'm horrified you can say that sentence without hearing yourself. Dad rubbed both hands over his face aggressively. You have no idea what pressure I'm under. Pressure doesn't make people cruel. It reveals who they already are. That hit him, I saw it immediately. But instead of reflecting, he got angry. That money could have helped this family. I closed my eyes briefly. There it was again, money, always money. You know what's insane? I said quietly. He spent years begging for emotional scraps from all of you. Dad looked away. And now suddenly you care because there's an inheritance missing. That's not fair. No, I replied. What's unfair is making a man feel unwanted until he finally leaves. Then, acting shocked, he took his dignity with him. For a second I thought he might yell. Instead, his voice lowered. When did you start hating us? That question caught me off guard, because the truth was I didn't hate them. I hated what they became. I started seeing you clearly, I answered softly. Dad looked at me for a long moment after that, then something unexpected happened. His anger cracked, just slightly. He used to take me fishing, he said quietly. I stayed silent. We'd wake up before sunrise. His eyes looked distant now. After Mom died, he tried really hard. That was the first genuinely vulnerable thing I'd heard from my father in years, maybe decades, and suddenly I saw it. Not an excuse, but an explanation. My father spent so long chasing status because somewhere deep down he still felt like the poor kid whose mother died early and whose father worked overtime covered in grease and exhaustion. He was ashamed of where he came from because he never healed from it. Still, pain doesn't excuse cruelty. Not ever. You should tell him that, I said quietly. Dad swallowed hard. I don't think he wants to hear from me. For the first time since all this began, I think he finally understood what he'd lost. A month after the wedding, my father's company started collapsing, not all at once. Slowly, like a building cracking from the inside before anybody notices structural damage. One project got delayed because of permit issues. Then an investor backed out unexpectedly. Then a contractor sued over unpaid invoices. By December, Dad looked 20 years older. The expensive confidence disappeared first, then the arrogance, then the illusion that money could protect him from consequences. I'd be lying if I said I felt nothing watching it happen. Part of me was angry enough to think, now you understand what instability feels like. But another part of me just felt tired. Because despite everything, he was still my father. And families are complicated in ways outsiders never fully understand. The strange thing was that Grandpa never celebrated any of it. Not once. The first time I mentioned Dad struggling financially, Grandpa just sat quietly for a while. Then he said, I never wanted him punished. I looked at him carefully. After everything? Yes. He folded his hands together gently. I wanted him to wake up, that's different. By then, Maple Grove had transformed him completely, not magically. Healing never works like that, but steadily. His cheeks had more color now. He walked more confidently. He started wearing actual button-up shirts again instead of old sweaters stretched thin with age. The staff adored him. Residents knocked on his door constantly asking for help fixing things, and his woodworking classes became unexpectedly popular. Every Thursday afternoon, 10 or 12 residents gathered in the workshop while Grandpa taught them how to sand wood properly, measure carefully, and stop rushing. Wood remembers impatience, he told them once. I sat quietly in the back corner watching him teach. Everybody listened, not politely. Genuinely, he mattered here, that was the difference. At my parents' house, his stories interrupted dinner. At Maple Grove, people pulled up chairs to hear them better. Around Christmas, the nonprofit fund officially launched. Grandpa insisted on naming it after my grandmother. The Evelyn Bennett Community Fund. I still remember the day we announced it publicly. We held a small event at the community center downtown. Nothing extravagant. Coffee, cookies, fold-out chairs, local volunteers, a few reporters. Grandpa almost backed out that morning because he got nervous speaking in front of crowds. "I'm just an old electrician," he muttered while adjusting his tie. I smiled. "You're the reason this exists." The event changed everything. More people showed up than expected. Seniors, care workers, families, volunteers, and once Grandpa started talking, the entire room went quiet, not because he sounded polished, because he sounded real. He spoke about loneliness, about invisibility, about what happens when older people stop feeling useful. At one point, his voice trembled slightly. "You can survive poverty," he said softly. "You can survive illness too." The room stayed silent. "But feeling unwanted by the people you love," he paused briefly. "That kind of loneliness changes a person." I saw several people wipe tears from their eyes, including me. Afterward, dozens of elderly attendees approached him privately. Some thanked him. Others just wanted someone to listen. One woman admitted she hadn't spoken to her son in 4 years. A retired teacher confessed she sometimes left the television running all night so the silence wouldn't feel so heavy. Grandpa listened to every single person carefully, patiently, like their pain mattered. Because to him, it did. That night, after the event ended, we sat together outside the community center beneath glowing streetlights while volunteers cleaned up inside. Grandpa looked exhausted but peaceful. "You know what surprises me most?" he said. "What? How many people feel forgotten?" He shook his head slowly. "And how hard they work to hide it." I leaned back against the bench beside him. "You helped them today." He smiled faintly. "Maybe they helped me too." The months passed quietly after that, not perfectly, but honestly. My relationship with my parents remained strained. Mom started texting more often, though. Small things at first. "How's work? How's Grandpa doing? Saw your article today." Nothing emotional, nothing direct. But underneath those messages, I sensed something unfamiliar. Shame. Real shame changes people slowly, not dramatically. It softens them first. Ethan changed faster. Probably because losing his marriage forced him to confront himself earlier than the others. His divorce from Emily happened less than a year after the wedding. Turns out pretending to be emotionally mature only works for so long. One rainy afternoon, he called me unexpectedly. "Can we talk?" I almost said no. Instead, I met him at a diner near the waterfront. He looked terrible. Not physically. Emotionally. Like somebody finally meeting themselves without distractions. After a few minutes of awkward silence, he stared down into his coffee and asked, "Do you think Grandpa hates me?" The question sounded so small coming from him. I answered honestly. "No." Ethan swallowed hard. "I don't understand how he can still love us after everything." I thought about that carefully, because he's not loving you based on who you were at your worst. Ethan rubbed his face tiredly. I keep replaying that wedding in my head. Neither of us spoke for a moment, then quietly he said, "I can't believe I cared more about gifts than whether he was there." At least he could say it now. Most people never reach that point. Self-awareness sounds simple until you realize how painful it actually is. A few weeks later, Ethan asked if I thought Grandpa would see him. I didn't answer immediately. "I don't know," I admitted. "But if you go, go honestly." He nodded, and for once, I believed he understood what that meant. The first visit happened in early spring. I wasn't there when Ethan arrived at Maple Grove. Grandpa told me about it afterward. Apparently, Ethan stood outside his room for almost 5 minutes before knocking. When Grandpa opened the door, Ethan started crying immediately. No speeches, no excuses, just crying. "I'm sorry," he kept saying over and over. Grandpa said that hurt more than anger ever could, because finally Ethan sounded like himself again, not the polished version trying to impress people, just a scared young man realizing too late how badly he failed someone who loved him. They sat together for nearly 3 hours, mostly talking, some silence too, the important kind. When Ethan left, Grandpa walked him downstairs personally. Then afterward, he sat quietly in the garden for a long time. "What are you thinking about?" I asked when I arrived later that evening. He smiled gently. "How strange life is." "What do you mean?" "You spend years trying to force people to become who you need them to be." He looked toward the sunset settling softly behind the trees. "But people only really change after they break." I thought about that for a long time because he was right. Growth usually arrives through pain, not wisdom. My mother visited 2 months later. That one was harder for both of them. She cried almost immediately after seeing him, not graceful crying either. Messy grief, real grief. "I'm sorry," she whispered repeatedly while holding his hands. "I'm so sorry." Grandpa forgave her faster than I expected, not because she deserved easy forgiveness, because he no longer wanted to carry bitterness. There's a difference. That took me years to understand. Forgiveness is not permission. It's release. My father came last, of course he did. Pride kept him away longer than the others. When he finally arrived at Maple Grove nearly 2 years after the wedding, I happened to be there already. I'll never forget seeing him standing awkwardly near the entrance holding a paper bag from Grandpa's favorite bakery. He looked terrified, actually terrified. I walked toward him slowly. "You came?" Dad nodded once, then quietly asked, "Does he still like apple fritters?" The question almost broke me, because suddenly he sounded less like an angry businessman and more like somebody's son again. When Grandpa saw him, neither man spoke at first. They just stared at each other, years of disappointment sitting silently between them. Then Dad finally said, "I should have been proud of you." Grandpa's face crumpled instantly, and just like that, the wall between them finally cracked. Not perfectly, not permanently. Healing never happens in one beautiful cinematic moment, but it started there, honestly. Humanly. That afternoon, the 3 of us sat together in the garden while spring sunlight warmed the walking paths around us. Residents passed by waving at Grandpa. Staff stopped to joke with him. Birds moved through the flower beds nearby. And for the first time in years, my family looked peaceful sitting together. Not impressive, not wealthy, not important. Just human. Before I left that evening, Grandpa walked with me toward the parking lot. He moved slower these days. Age still existed, after all, but there was lightness in him now. Real lightness. "You know," he said softly, "leaving that house saved my life." I looked at him carefully. "I know," he smiled. "For a long time, I thought getting older meant becoming less valuable." A breeze moved gently through the trees around us. But that wasn't true. He looked back toward the building behind him, where laughter drifted faintly through an open window. I was just surrounded by people who stopped seeing me clearly. I felt tears sting my eyes immediately, because I understood now. This story was never really about a wedding, or inheritance, or money. It was about what happens when people confuse presence with love. My family thought giving Grandpa a room in their house meant they cared for him, but love isn't measured by proximity. It's measured by attention, by patience, by whether somebody feels visible when they are beside you. A year later, Grandpa stood beside me at the coast watching waves crash beneath a cold, gray sky. One of the things from his list, visit the ocean again. We stayed there almost an hour without talking much. Then suddenly he smiled and said, "You know what the best part of getting older is?" "What?" "You finally stop wasting time pretending." The wind carried his laughter out across the water, and standing there beside him, I realized something quietly beautiful. He hadn't spent the last years of his life waiting to die. He finally started living again, the way he always deserved to.